Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of our What If series. We've got, as guest hosts today, we've got Craig and George Sybert from the Musing Podcast. Guys, welcome again to the show. Happy to have you back. We've got an interesting topic today, so why don't you guys say hello to the fans out there?
Hey, guys.
What's up? Good to be back.
Yep. Thanks for having us on again.
Love being on here.
Love having you guys on, and we've got a really good topic today that we can kind of discuss at length today. So today's What If is actually something we've been kind of mulling about for a while. It's on that long list of what if scenarios that we have. And it's a really cool one because I think this one will involve a lot of different scenarios, because if this what if had happened, it sets off a ripple chain of events that would be totally different than what we've had. So the what if today is, what if Randy Rhoads never left Quiet Riot and lived? Okay. So Craig, why don't you kind of kickstart us off here? And I mean, this is an interesting one because all of a sudden throws a lot of things out the window that were like major hard rock and metal events, right?
Exactly. And I think one kind of circumvents the other. I think if he stays with Quiet Riot, he doesn't die. And that's just, the blanket. But I'll have to say that, I had a local band in Tampa, Florida. Contrast was the name of the band. And the singer was a huge Randy Rhoads fan. I mean, that was his life. So I'd heard Quiet Riot 1 and 2, which are the albums that were released with Randy Rhoads actually on them. They were only released in Japan or China.
Correct. Yeah, Japan. Yeah.
Japan. They never got released in the States, but he had bootleg copies that they used to call them at the time. And there were cassettes, which was kind of weird. But so I'd heard Quiet Riot 1 and Quiet Riot 2 a long time ago. Not only that, but I've got a lot of history with Randy Rhoads because our singer was a huge Randy Rhoads fan. Patrick Williams was his name, and just gaga over him. And, I know George just dropped a bomb just before we dropped in to start talking and saying he wasn't a big Randy Rhoads fan. But I sort of echo that. I am a fan of him as a musician, and I love the lore of what he brought after Ozzy left Sabbath and went out on his own. And I love this whole backstory of him being with Quiet Riot and what happened and why they broke up or why he left. But his music, and I'll kind of explain it this way. It feels like he was so restrained in Quiet Riot that he was kind of held to, doing only rhythms and kind of chunky stuff and not getting into his soloing and all the stuff that he was kind of famous for. And then as soon as he got into Ozzy, or was it Blizzard of Oz that came first, or was it?
Well, it's probably technically one and the same, right? Yeah, I mean, it was called the Blizzard of Oz band, but it was Ozzy's solo band.
Yeah. So, but when he got into that, it felt like he went over the edge. Like he's like, I'm going to play all kinds of arpeggios and solos and throw everything I can into these songs. And I don't know. So my thought would be is if he stayed with Quiet Riot, I think that he would have started stretching Kevin. Is it Dubrow or Dubrow?
Dubrow, yeah.
Dubrow. I think he would have started stretching his idea of what could be done with guitar in the band. And I think Kevin was the one that was holding a lot of that back and keeping him from being the arpeggios and being the person that runs scales and had really extensive solos and stuff.
Well, that virtuoso that he was clearly in Ozzy's band, right?
Yeah, and again, I think if you read some of the background stories, basically that's what Ozzy said is do whatever you want, go at it. You've been locked up basically in a room for so long, go at it. I think if he would have stayed with Quiet Riot, if Ozzy hadn't come along, I think that he probably would have started expanding them. I think, Slick Black Cadillac's actually on 2, and it's on what's the Metal Health?
Metal Health, yeah.
Yeah, and if you listen to the difference in those, man, there is miles difference. Even though it's the same song, you can definitely hear his influence on Quiet Riot, and then his influence gone away on the second one. I think if he would have stayed with him, I think they really would have expanded themselves and made a much better album on that Metal Health. And that's kind of my starting stance.
Yeah, well, you also have to take into account too that first Quiet Riot album was 1977.
Mm-hmm.
That second one was 79. And then, Blizzard of Oz came out in what was that very, very early 81, right?
Yep.
And the Quiet Riot Mental Health album, what was that?
83.
83, right?
Yeah.
So I think, my personal opinion, if he would have stayed in Quiet Riot, because quite frankly, I know there's probably people going to say, no, they're great, but those first two Quiet Riot albums, they're not very good.
No.
And I absolutely agree with you. I don't think that's Randy Rhoads. I think he grew considerably as a musician in those few short years. I don't think those first two albums, that's not the Randy Rhoads we all know. And there's flashes here and there, but those songs are very glammy. I'll tell you what, those two albums for me is almost like the template for a band like Poison, because you listen to those albums and they're a little bit ahead of their time as far as like that kind of glam metal, glam rock, hair metal, whatever the hell you want to call it, that bands like Poison and so on and so forth were doing 6, 7, 8 years later.
But you have to also consider, how old was he when he died? 23 or something like that?
I think he was 26, I think.
26?
Yeah.
So,
I can tell you. Hold on.
between those first
25,
two,
yeah.
25?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you have to consider, he died in what? What year did he die, though, did it say?
82.
Okay, so he died in 82. You're talking 5, 6 years prior to that, even 7 years prior to that, maybe recording and writing. And you have to think he was 17, 18, 19, 20 years old in Quiet Riot. And maybe his virtuosity blossomed maybe, most guitar players get better the more they play.
And this guy was notorious for playing like 10, 15 hours a day. That's well known.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
So if you add, or if you take away 5 to 7 years of that much practice, maybe when he was in Quiet Riot, maybe that's part of the reason they, of the break. Maybe that he wanted to get better and to move on and to move out and to bigger and better things. And that's what I think that's what fractured that.
But I think that's the question, though, is what if he would have stayed with them?
So how does Metal Health sound with Randy Rhoads as opposed to Carlos Cavazo, who fine guitar player, but there's really no comparison there, in my opinion.
True. Well, now was there 2 guitar players when Randy Rhoads was with them? Because Rudy Sarzo and Carlos Cavazo they both played guitar on Metal Health, correct?
Rudy was the bass player.
Oh, Rudy was the bass player.
Yeah, there was, to my knowledge, it was only one guitar player in both.
One guitar player on both, yeah.
Okay. Well,
I don't know. That Metal Health album is a big difference and a big step up, in my opinion, from those first two with Randy.
Oh,
there's a lot of guitar on there, right? Carlos, like I said, not a bad guitar player. That's a guitar album.
I have to say, I have heard both of those albums because of Craig's lead singer in his band. I had heard those albums 20 years ago, early 90s probably. I heard both of those Quiet Riot albums because they were imports, and you have to listen to this. I was like, oh, okay, and it didn't click. Now
they're not very good, in my opinion.
When Metal Health came out, it's like, wow, this, as far as early 80s, that's what I considered heavy metal. In 83, that was a pretty hard album, really. Metal Health was pretty solid. And it had a number of, and Craig's got his computer up. I bet it had at least 3 top 40 hits, if not more than that. You had Come On Feel the Noise, you had Metal Health, you had Slick Black Cadillac, there was a lot. I don't think that I actually became a fan of Quiet Riot because of Metal Health, and went and listened back to the other ones. I'm like, and I didn't realize, at the time that was still, in my teens. So I didn't really realize, Randy Rhoads was in that original band because they were Japanese imports, and I didn't get that whole scenario back then.
And so it's almost like it didn't matter, because I think when people first started to know who Randy Rhoads was because of being an Aussie, Quiet Riot were really not doing anything. So it's almost like, oh, he was in this obscure band called Quiet Riot, and it wasn't until a few years later that Metal Health came out, and all of a sudden now people are talking, oh yeah, that's the band that Randy Rhoads was in. But at the time, did anybody care? Not really. So you have to wonder, like, if Randy stayed and they did Metal Health, would it have sounded differently? And if he would have continued on with the band past that album, because I think, in my opinion, they went quickly downhill right after that.
Yeah.
Sure.
You got to wonder if, what was it? Condition Critical was that the next one, which sounded just like Metal Health, but not as good.
QR3 was worse than that one. Was worse than both of those.
Well, I think when you look at, it's interesting too, because I hadn't heard those albums in a while, and I went and listened to both of them before this to kind of, so we could talk about it. And I think it's the second or third song on the second album. You can almost hear the riff of Bark at the Moon in one of those Quiet Riot songs.
Wow.
Like, if you listen really close, I'm
going to have to go check that out. Yeah. I listened to them today, but I wasn't listening so carefully that I could have heard that.
Yeah, you listen to the second or third song, there's that little gallop that he does in Bark at the Moon. Or is it Bark at the Moon? Might be Diary of a Madman. Regardless, if you listen to it, like the first, second song on the second album, you can kind of hear that. So he was writing music, and that music might have carried over to the next to that Quiet Riot album, to Metal Health. So you might have gotten some type of Ozzy sounding songs in there.
I mean, those were all his riffs, right?
Exactly.
So why wouldn't they have shown up on Quiet Riot albums?
Exactly.
Yeah, but do you think do you think Metal Health would have even happened with Randy Rhoads? What if? I mean, seriously. I mean, because you could play devil's advocate and say, okay, well, if he moves to Ozzy but stays alive, I mean, you can play both scenarios. So if he does leave Quiet Riot and they make Metal Health, which, I mean, let's face it, I mean, it's secured Quiet Riot's place in with one hit, that "Come On, Feel the Noise." I mean, it's an anthem. It's an anthem. I mean, it's theirs now. Yeah. I mean, it's, when you say that song, people think Quiet Riot.
Well, because Slade was never anybody in this country.
Right, exactly.
We're just, a band that was huge in Europe, still beloved over there, but to U.S. people, they're like, who the hell is Slade?
Yeah, who the hell is Slade?
Right. Come On, Feel the Noise is a Quiet Riot song to everybody.
Exactly. So like I said, so now if you bump it, what if he stayed alive but decided to split and went with Ozzy Osbourne? Do you think Ozzy Osbourne, I mean, because to be honest, I mean, Ozzy's had nothing but above average guitar players before and since. I mean, Tony Iommi and Zakk Wylde, and the man doesn't fool around as far as guitar work is concerned.
Yeah.
I mean, even since from the late 60s. So, I mean, what do you guys think Ozzy Osbourne's music would sound like if Randy was still alive?
Yeah, I mean, that's a key here. So, Ozzy was at a pretty low point when he got booted out of Sabbath, right? So here, he decided, I'm going to go put together my own band. He very luckily came across Randy Rhoads, and they formed this musical partnership, and we all know the rest is history. But what if there's no Randy Rhoads? Does he find someone else, maybe with that much talent, that could have helped? Because, I mean, let's face it, Ozzy was a very popular singer from a legendary band.
Huge.
But does that spark and that quick success happen without Randy Rhoads?
Right. Does he
we don't know.
grasp at something because maybe it takes 6 or 8 months longer, and he's chomping at the bit to get, an album out. He wants to start recording again. He just grabs he's looked at 17 other guitar players, and he's just going to grab one now because he really wants to start writing music. You don't get Mr. Crowley. You don't get Crazy Train. You don't get, Diary of a Madman. You don't get those songs that are iconic. Those songs might have been, Quiet Riot songs if he'd have stayed with them. But you're right. If he doesn't go to Ozzy, or if he goes to, he skips out and just goes somewhere else, I think if he goes anywhere but Ozzy, he lives. I think that what happened in the situation that he lost his life in was only because he had went to Ozzy and got, I mean, they got big fast.
Really fast, yeah.
Very fast. And I think, like you said, he was 24, 25 years old. Somebody to be, in a band, Quiet Riot, making good, decent music and kind of getting by, to be handed like the keys to the kingdom and saying, you're going to do what you do best, and you're going to do it at your whim. Do whatever you want. And I think that just really got, he just went off on a tangent.
With an already legendary vocalist that's got
Right.
15 years worth of street cred, I mean, that's hard to, I mean, I'm the same way. I think it was, and himself, I mean, you're on a path of self-destruction anyway. At that time, I mean, in the early 80s, come on. I mean, if you listen to any stories, I mean, that genre of Ozzy Osbourne's life is obviously a black hole. I mean, I don't know the man, but I mean, anything that you read or hear or see or watch it was pretty much self-destructive behavior. And
the 80s for Ozzy was, I mean, the guy was living a rock star life, right?
Absolutely.
It was like his second, almost like second wind, right? Because after, he was at the bottom of the barrel after getting booted from Sabbath. He had nowhere to go but up, really, because he was already down as low as you can be.
Right.
So, and I want to
go ahead.
Go ahead, George.
And I said when you add a 23, 24-year-old guitar virtuoso that here's everything.
Yeah.
Then it just just big smoky fire.
So I wanted to touch on something that Craig brought up before, which when it comes to like the songwriting. So, those first two albums, so Blizzard of Oz and Diary of the Madman, were co-written, and I don't know exactly like who wrote what, the music, the lyrics, all, but we have to put the Bob Daisley factor, who was the bass player, who was integral to writing and arranging a lot of those songs, and the drummer Lee Kerslake, who was from Uriah Heep. But I still think that Randy was responsible for all those riffs and a lot of those arrangements the way we know it. So I think if you bring anybody else in, and we could talk about a million other guitar players who maybe could have been in that, role, Gary Moore, Michael Schenker, Joe Perry, Bernie Torme, Eddie Van Halen, whatever. You could lay out. They're all so different. Do those songs still sound the same, even maybe with the same lyrics?
No.
And they don't, right? They don't.
No.
So
there are certain guitar players that have that certain tone, that certain feel. They play it, that Randy was known for the flying V, I mean, those certain guitars, I mean, like even James Hetfield, playing the Traveler, that certain guitars, certain tones, certain setups, but I think Randy's guitar sound was just as distinct through those songs. And I don't think anybody else, even if you played the exact same notes, is going to come off the same way. He
had a very distinct sound. Still to this day, you listen to those two Ozzy albums, and
even an overrated song or an overplayed song, I should say, like Crazy Train, that rhythm, that through that entire sound, or the sound through that entire song, is I've never heard it duplicated to make a guitar just flow the way that song flows. And I'm tired of hearing the song, but it's still an amazing piece of music.
Yep, I agree.
And even if you listen to those two albums back to back, the first one feels very unkempt. It's
raw.
Yeah, and a lot of his guitar parts aren't very tuned in. And then you kind of go to the next album right after, and it sounds a little more refined. So you get Diary of Madman, and you get a lot more refined sound from him, but still his tone and his soloing. We kind of made this a two-part thing. What if he hadn't left Quiet Riot, and what if he hadn't died? If he doesn't die, where does Ozzy go from there? I mean, Randy Rhoads is just getting into his prime.
Yeah.
Ozzy's getting a little late in his prime. I mean, he's kind of getting
maybe Ozzy dies.
Well, that's a possibility too. But I mean, you got to think about it. Is Randy going to see bigger lights? Is he going to see? Zach? How long was Zach with him? 5 or 10 years?
Zach Wild.
Yeah.
Well, you had Jakey Lee first, who was to do the whole history here. So Randy dies. They get Bernie Torme from Ian Gillan's band to sit in for a week, and then they bring in Brad Gillis from Night Ranger, and he does a tour. They record the Speak of the Devil album, and then Jakey Lee comes in, who was in Rat briefly, and then he only stayed for 2 albums, and then Zach was kind of in the band for a while.
Yeah.
Like what, a decade or so? You
So
know,
I said it was 5 to 10 years he was good in the band.
Even recently, he toured with him recently.
Yeah, he's back again. Yeah.
But I mean, he had an amazing solo career afterwards. So does Randy see these 2 albums and they maybe make a third and, scratch out a fourth and go, the world's in front of me. I'm 28 years old and I've got, people coming at me saying, hey, you should be doing solo stuff, or I write most of the stuff anyways. Why do I need Ozzy kind of thing? I honestly see Randy. No, I'm serious. Think about it though. I mean, you're talking about a guy who is iconic, but was kicked out, whatever you want to call it, from Sabbath. Makes a couple of really good, solo albums. Maybe trails off on 3 and 4. Who knows? But with Randy, probably not. But then, or if he makes success, Randy goes, I could be making a lot of money, or hey, I really want to start making my own music, or maybe I want to sing. I mean, we've seen other guitar players think that they can sing and get out there and make their own solo albums. So
but I think he was, even at that young age, I think he was smart enough to realize that, his bread was buttered on both sides, really. And when you get to that point, I agree with you. I'm not saying that he wouldn't have left, but I'm thinking side projects and or super groups, because you talk about mid-late 80s, there started to creep some of those in, and there started to be collaborations with other bands and so on and so forth, of other people that had gone away and whatever like that. There's some, and a lot of singers, guitar players were switching bands, and because like I said, Dio went to Black Sabbath, and then he had and then solo career too after that, much like Ozzy. I guess you could very easily draw a pretty straight
there's
line.
There's parallels there. Yeah. That's a great point. My take on this, and going back to Craig's point from a couple minutes ago, I personally think that there is a marketed change in his talent between the Blizzard of Oz album and Diary of a Madman. We're talking a year, not even.
Right.
I hear it on the album. That kid was improving like daily.
Sound and technique, both.
Absolutely. So
100%.
there has been talk, through the years, that Randy was already thinking of life after Ozzy. Okay.
I was just going to read that on Wikipedia. You finish and I'll read what it says. Go ahead.
And if you go to listen, all right, so Randy dies, Jakey Lee comes into the band, they do Bark at the Moon, they do The Ultimate Sin. Now I've listened to both of those albums a couple times in the last couple of months, and there is a huge difference in sound, not just the guitar players, between those 4 albums. So the 2 with Randy, the 2 with Jakey Lee. Granted, Bark at the Moon and Ultimate Sin came out mid-late 80s when hard rock and metal was kind of, the MTV thing was happening. It was all about the videos. A lot of the heavier bands are doing these commercial ballads and all this stuff. There's this kind of like bright, shiny sheen to a lot of the heavier bands' album releases. I don't know if that's something that Randy would have either allowed to happen or partaken in. So I think when Craig brings up, Randy might have gotten tired of that whole thing. And maybe if Randy stays, they don't make albums that sound like that. That Ozzy doesn't do albums that sounded like those 2. I don't know. But I think, and also we have to think, right around this time, the Shrapnel Records thing was starting to happen. So you had all these like shredder guitar players releasing instrumental solo albums, Yngwie Malmsteen, Tony McAlpine, Vinnie Moore. The list goes on and on, right? Satriani, all those guys. Would Randy have wanted to go that route too?
Ooh.
And to George's point, who's to say that in 1987 or 88, Randy leaves Ozzy, Vivian Campbell leaves Dio, and Ronnie James Dio and Randy Rhoads decide to make an album together? Because how cool would that be, right? Because that's like a marriage made in heaven right there.
Gone. My mind's gone.
So here's the explosion.
Well, no, I agree with that. I do see that route, but you just brought up something really interesting. It could have been G4 Tour. He honestly, with the way he was playing and the way he didn't agree with a lot of the 2 bands he was in, basically. If you read some of the stories about Quiet Riot, there was some guns and shooting people involved in it. So I think the fact that he didn't work well with them, for starters, and I'll read what it was said about Ozzy. It says, at the time of his death, Rhoads had already made the decision to part ways with Osbourne once his contractual obligation had been fulfilled. They had a good relationship with Osbourne. Though he had a good relationship with Osbourne, the vocalist's constant drug and alcohol abuse made day-to-day life on the tour difficult. Yeah. And so if you take that, and he was already kind of tired of that, what's the next thing is solo. I mean, and at the time, like you said, that would have been, when did Satriani and Vi really kind of, Vi was with Roth for
a
couple of years.
Yeah, 2 albums.
Two albums.
White Snake for an album, but I think he did the Passion and Warfare album and the first one in between all that stuff. So he was 85, 86, he was already doing solo albums, and Satch was right around the same time.
And you got he would have fell right directly in with those guys. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, and you know, Satriani even towards the end started singing a little bit, and I could definitely, I hadn't really thought about that angle, but that's a really good point. He could have been the G4, the fourth, you know, guitar player in that big three group. That's a great point. Hadn't thought about that.
So one thing we haven't really talked about here is his place in guitar history. Okay, so at the time with those first 2 Ozzy albums, there were a lot of people saying, because you know Eddie was the man. Eddie Van Halen, or Edward Van Halen, whatever you want to call him, was the man at that time. When Randy came out, and granted, there are certain aspects of Randy's playing that kind of falls into that Eddie style, but I think that Randy used a lot of the kind of classical influence, which we saw a lot of with guys like Yngwie and McAlpine and so on and so forth. So I personally have always had a hard time elevating Randy to like the gods of the guitar genre, because there's such a small
you beat me to
sample, right? It really is. As great as he is on those albums, I just, and he is great. He was great. But say he lives and he goes on to make another album with Ozzy, maybe leaves, does a couple solo albums. Like, where would Randy Rhoads sit today among the guitar gods if he was still alive today, and with all these years since, to be able to create music and do whatever type of project?
I think the fact that we're having this conversation about him with a 2 to 4 year body of work says where he would be.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say that. I was actually going to say that maybe he just didn't have enough time to make his mark. But, you know, you made a good point. You know, we're talking about a guy who 2 to 4 years made 2 mediocre albums with Quiet Riot, but still, you know, made a mark somewhere, and then made 2 phenomenal albums that will stand the test of time. Part of that's Ozzy. Not going to take, you know, away from it. But you're right. You're talking about a guitar virtuoso who became a rock musician. And while that doesn't happen that way very often, he was still in a pretty small group of guys who played that way. Like you said, like Eddie and Malmsteen and them. I personally am not a fan of Ozzy in that time frame. I'm personally not a fan of those 2 albums, but I know where they are in history. And there's a couple songs off them I like. More the obscure stuff, not stuff that gets played on the radio on a regular basis. But I think Randy Rhoads did not get enough time. I think with enough time, he would have been Eddie Van Halen, or, you know, pick any guys from that time frame that you know, even down to the guys from ZZ Top or something. You know, those guys have made their mark on in history. The guys from Leonard Skinner, you know, those 2 guitar players that can play off each other all the time. I think he would have had his place, even if it was only to be a solo musician after he left Sabbath. I think he would have certainly made his mark. He just didn't get enough time.
I agree with you. And there's a lot of people who probably think that those 2 albums are enough to put him in that pantheon.
Is it?
I don't know. Well, it's not really for us to decide, right? I personally, I love him. I love the playing on those albums. And is he one of the greats? Sure. Could he have been like a top 3 guy of all time? Could be. Probably. I have a hard time laying that on him for just really those 2 albums, because I don't quite frankly, I don't think the stuff, those 2 Quiet Riot albums are all that. They're okay for what they are. But
do you think by his talent level, do you think he would have become like hard to work with, like Eddie Van Halen, or like so many other guitar virtuosos that want to be kind of more in the spotlight. And, you know, when you've like Van Halen, when you've got a huge personality like David Lee Roth and you've got a huge guitar virtuoso like Eddie Van Halen, it kind of obviously clashed and it came to a smoking, screeching halt, you know? And then do you think, like you said, he was already talking about leaving Ozzy after his contract was up? Do you think he already knew that he could be bigger and like Ozzy was just his meal ticket and he could have been bigger and better than he could have taken over the world? Do you think he would have been one of those, I hate to put it that way, one of those hard to work with assholes that nobody wants to sing with, or nobody, you know, and then he has to play solo?
I don't know. I mean, based on what you read, most people said that he was a joy to work with and a really nice, shy guy. So, but who knows, right? We didn't really know him. So it's hard to say. But I personally think he was driven by the artistic nature of what he wanted to create. Sure. And I think that and again, this is based on what we hear on the Diary of a Madman album, which is some pretty sophisticated stuff on there that I think we can attribute most of to Randy. So I think that deep down inside, he had things he wanted to accomplish in music that went above and beyond whatever he could do with Ozzy. And I think, because we mentioned before, they were good friends. They were buddies, right? But I think Ozzy was a destructive party animal. Randy was not that way. Randy would sit and play his guitar all day long, and that's what he wanted to do. And I think that would have run its course eventually.
Yeah, I never really got that arrogant feeling from him. And everything I've read and every video interviews and stuff I've seen of him, I never really got that arrogant attitude from Randy Rhoads. The music was most important to him. Like playing guitar was the only thing he really cared about. And I think that was, Ozzy Osbourne was his cart to get on to use that music to get somewhere to where he wanted to go. So So I think we're all in agreement that whether he had stayed in
Quiet Riot or whether that the plane crash never happened and he would have lived in Ozzy, he would have been out of those bands at some point shortly thereafter, regardless.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. If he would have stayed in Quiet Riot, I think he would have pulled them up higher than they ever thought they could have been.
I still think Pete's right, though. I don't think they would have. Maybe one or two albums past that, he would have been gone. I really do. I think.
Sure, but that's.
But they would have been more than like the one-hit album wonders, which they really.
Yeah, I just say they would have. I think he would have pulled them to a level of like Metal Health, and then another good one after that, and then people would have went back and bought the first two albums just because he was on them, and I think he would have rose that up to a level of, where we got the release, an American release of these first two albums because holy crap, Randy.
And I don't know what the legal reasons are, but why have those albums never been officially released?
I was just going to say that they've never been released ever.
It's got to be tied up in some kind of legality. It has to be.
I'm sure it's something to do with the record label and royalties.
It's like those first couple Pantera albums. It's the same thing.
Yep.
George, don't you have one of those?
Yes.
Is that an import?
It was.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah. But no, it's. I think not to get off on a tangent. I do think he's he, obviously, like I said earlier, if three guys are having a conversation about him literally 40 years after his death, it has to be, you have to consider the guy as one of the best ever to play, even though he's got an incredibly small body of work, and no pun intended. I know he was a tiny human being. So there has to be, that has to merit some sort of.
Oh, absolutely it does. Absolutely does. And I'll throw my little story in here. So the first ever rock concert that I went to see was the Blizzard of Oz tour in 1981 at a little place in Poughkeepsie, New York, Mid-Hudson Civic Center. And I was sitting in, I think, the 12th or 15th row right in front of Randy Rhoads. And he was indeed a short, tiny little guy with this big polka dot flying V guitar. And he had a larger-than-life persona on stage. And again, I wish my memories were better. I was 15 years old. It's a long time ago. But I'll never forget that. Even if I don't really remember everything that happened, I just remember being mesmerized by this, guy up there, just playing the Flying V. He brought out he had the white the Gibson Custom, and man, larger than life sound, larger than life kind of stage presence. And he had Ozzy, next to him doing it just was really cool memory, a really cool memory.
So interesting that you'd say that, because again, I was doing a little bit of reading on it, and the polka dots obviously was something that he carried, but he actually started that with the Quiet Riot days. And what they said is when they would get on stage, as they were coming back and playing kind of the same places, because they were playing a bunch of local places, people were starting to come in wearing polka dots.
Wow.
They were coming in, mimicking him and trying to wear what he was wearing. So
I wonder if that original. So I wonder if that probably wasn't a Jackson that he was playing in the Quiet Riot days.
Couldn't have been.
Right. So probably once he joined Ozzy, they were like, all right, we got to give this guy his own guitar. So
give him some money. Give him a guitar.
It makes me feel like
name out there.
But I mean, just the way you remembered that story, though, makes me feel like that maybe he was the reason that those bands were coming up and getting bigger. And maybe if he, I hate to circle back, but had he not left Quiet Riot, they may have just exploded. I mean, mental health might even been 10 times better than it was, and people would be wearing polka dots at 10,000 people shows instead of 500 people shows. But it's interesting that he stood out to you on stage going to an Ozzy concert, technically, because Ozzy's the big draw, but he was the one thing that stood out to you. And I think they even mentioned that Dubrow was kind of upset that when they showed up to shows, people were wearing polka dots to mimic him instead of, the lead singer. So,
yeah. And I don't know the history too much, but, I don't remember ever hearing about Quiet Riot here in the States when Randy was in the band. So considering that those first two albums were only ever released in Japan, you got to wonder if most of the live stuff they were doing was in Japan, which would make sense because Japanese fans are very different from here. They love their heavy bands over there. They could have been fairly big in Japan at the time. We would have never known it here because again, no internet back there. No, we wouldn't know, right? It's like unless they showed up in Hit Parade or Cream magazine, who knows?
Actually, it says Quiet Riot quickly became one of the most popular acts in the Los Angeles club circuit by late '76. That's crazy.
Okay. So with Van Halen and all those other bands, then I guess.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't remember hearing much about them.
Randy Rhoads' polka dot theme became the visual focal point of the band. Yeah, see, that's what I said. It's interesting that you mentioned that he stood out as bigger than life, and maybe he was it's one of those things where you just hate to see that. I mean, I know you're not a Nirvana fan, but Kurt Cobain taken way too early. Even Lennon. I mean, he had a pretty seasoned career, but he still had another 10, 15 years of writing music, and it's sad. It's sad to see these guys taken, some of them, pretty early in their life to not get that whole, catalog of music and that we get the praise and look after. So
Dimebag Darrell, a lot of them.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to touch on Lennon for a second, I mean, they'd been around 15 years, 16 years or whatever. I mean, he died in 80, 81 when he was killed.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I mean, that's triple what Randy Rhoads had, or almost 4 times what, as long as Randy Rhoads was, part of the musical landscape, I guess I should say. And the Beatles had already been the Beatles for 10 years.
Yeah, well, the Beatles had most of the 60s, and then they all did their solo stuff throughout the 70s. And I'm sure Lennon would have had a pretty prolific solo career beyond 1980 if he wasn't, assassinated.
Agreed.
Yeah.
That's for another rant.
Yeah, it's for another one. So that's I think we all agree that if Randy had stayed in Quiet Riot and lived, he would eventually have left Quiet Riot and he would have done some really great things. Even if he would have left Quiet Riot and gone to Ozzy and the plane crash never happened, he still would have gone to do more great things, I guess. So it's just a shame any way you look at it, but it's interesting to talk about. So thanks, guys. I appreciate you coming on here and talking about this. This was kind of fun, and I like the fact that this one was almost like a flower, right? You can pick the petals off, and it's got all these combinations and all these possibilities and things like that.
Absolutely.
So guys, tell us where all of our viewers can find you guys outside of here.
We are Music Musing Podcast. You can find us on pretty much any platform. You can email us at musicmusingfeedback@gmail.com. We're on Twitter at musicmusing_. There's a cool Instagram page. I'm not sure who handles it, but maybe George.
I do that once every other day or so or whatever. There's some good stuff on there. Or try
search Music Musing or Craig or George Sybert, Sybert, and on pretty much any platform you can find us out there.
Yep.
Cool.
And you gave them the musicmusingfeedback@gmail.com for
always.
All right.
Awesome. So for everybody out there watching, give us some ideas for future what ifs. We got a whole stack of a whole big list, but most of the good ideas that I get on this channel are from our dedicated viewers. So if you got something that you'd love to hear us sit and pontificate about for a half hour, 40 minutes, we'd love to hear it. And visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're on YouTube often. Don't touch that dial, because tomorrow morning we got a really special show. We're going to be doing one of our classic album war shows with a special guest. We've got Jeff Young, ex-guitar player from Megadeth, joining the show tomorrow.
Wow.
We're talking about we're going to be matching up the debut album from Montrose with the debut album from Boston. So, George, you can't miss this one. So don't miss it, guys. And Craig and George, thanks a lot for joining. And we'll see you next month for another What If episode. And everybody else, thanks again. Have a good night, and we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
See you.